All right. Okay. So we're at an exciting point in our lesson. We're going to just pick up where we left off last week. Last week we were talking about, can you turn me down just a smidge? I'm a little loud. Last week we were talking about the KJV preface and how was it removed from our Bibles? Why don't we have the preface anymore? And basically, what we went to is we went through history and we came to, I think it was 1829. I don't have it on the slide right here, but in 1829, the American Bible Society had a campaign, and their campaign was to get the Bible into every single American home. And this was their goal. And they had the technology to do it. This was the first time we had automated printing presses. So prior to this, we had printing presses, which increased how many people could have the Bible in their hand. It reduced the cost of Bibles. But in the 1800s, we got the steam press. And this was a huge innovation in technology, which allowed publishers to automate the printing process. And so the American Bible Society took this new technology and applied it to the Bible, but they wanted to, in order to achieve this goal, to get a Bible into every single home in America, they had to do it as inexpensively as possible. So they were going to cut every corner they could in order to reduce the cost of the Bible. And ways they decided to reduce the cost of the Bible is up there. One, they were going to remove the Apocrypha. The KJV still had the Apocrypha in it up to this point. So there's a bunch of pages that they were going to remove. They were going to remove all the footnotes because it complicated the text block. And they are also, they deemed them unimportant. That was not the KJV translator's viewpoint, nor is it mine. But they decided to remove the footnotes and leave just the text block. And then the last thing that they were going to do is remove the preface itself. And so those three decisions, plus the steam press, they got the Bibles down to the cost of about a day's wage for a hayer, which was a big deal because we went from, like I said, about a week's wage in the Reformation to basically a house wage prior to the printing press. You know, not a house wage, but what do I mean? Buying a house. It was about the equivalent of buying a house prior to the printing press to own a Bible. And now we're at a day's wage. And then here today, obviously, we're less than an hour's wage for most people to get a Bible today. But 1800s, mid 1800s, we're talking about early mid 1800s, we're talking about a day's wage for a Bible. And they were their goal was to get one in every home. And they sold and gave away. I think I just said sold last week, but between selling and giving away Bibles, because if you were very poor, they just gave them to you. They had a way for you just to receive one for free. They got the Bible into about 1 million Americans' hands, 1 million, which was a huge feat at the time because, like I said last week, there was only about 13 million Americans. So 1 in 13 people had a Bible from the American Bible Society. Now, I didn't mention this last week, but I meant to. The American Bible Society was not the only publisher. There are other publishers out there who were printing the King James at this point. But the American Bible Society so greatly undercut all the other publishers, none of them could compete unless they did the same thing the American Bible Society did. So all of the other publishers did the same thing. They cut the Apocrypha, they cut the footnotes, and they cut the preface just so they can stay in competition. And that is how essentially all of us, for the most part, with the exception of Cambridge Bibles, have lost the preface, the footnotes, and the Apocrypha from our King James Bibles. And then we moved on to talk about Edgar J. Goodspeed, who was alive when KJV onlyism raised its head. And I'm not going to read the whole quote again, but essentially what he says is we need to republish the preface, because if the preface were published and people were able to read it, it would correct the errors of King James onlyism. And I agree with him. And he wrote that in 1935. And then we moved on to Bruce Metzger. Bruce Metzger, he gives a list of accolades that we tend to give to the King James. And he says those accolades actually belong to other Bibles that the King James translators utilized. So he says things like, let me pull it up here. All right. A great deal of praise, therefore, that has been given to it, the King James Bible, belongs to its predecessors. For idiom and vocabulary, Tyndale deserves the greatest credit. For melody and harmony, Coverdale. For scholarship and accuracy, the Geneva version. And he's right. Remember, the King James, oh, actually, I say remember. This is the remember slide. The King James translation was not just a translation, it was a revision. It was primarily a revision of the Bishop's Bible. And the King James translators used all of the works on the screen to some extent or another to finish their translation. So they had the works of Erasmus, Tyndale, Coverdale, and John Rogers, the works of the Complutensian Polyglot, the works of Stephanus, the works of the Geneva Bible, the works, and I say works because there's many editions of each, the works of Beza, the works of the Bishop's Bible, the work of Daniel Bomberg, the works of the Latin Vulgate, and the works of the Septuagint, and other works as well. This making something unique during the Reformation period that was not the norm. The norm during the Reformation period was more of a diplomatic solution. Remember, diplomatic texts are texts that come from one manuscript. So Tyndale was a diplomatic translation of Erasmus. Erasmus released a Greek New Testament, and Tyndale translated from that nearly exclusively. Then we had Coverdale doing the same thing, John Rogers doing the same thing from Erasmus. And then from Stephanus, they translate the Geneva Bible. And then from Beza, we also get later editions of the Geneva Bible, but we also get the Bishop's Bible. And then from there, we have the King James. I'm talking primarily New Testament. The ones on the bottom there are, well, Daniel Bomberg is Old Testament. If you remember, we mentioned Daniel Bomberg. He is the printer during the Reformation that reprints the Rabbi Joseph ben Chaim's Old Testament. So that's the Bomberg text that the KJV translators used for the Old Testament. The Latin Vulgate was used for both Old and New Testament, and the Septuagint was used for Old Testament only because that's all it contains. And so the King James translation is an eclectic text. Unlike most of the other English translations during that day, which were diplomatic, they were being translated from one text. The King James was being translated and revising multiple texts simultaneously. And so it was truly an eclectic text, unlike other Bibles. And that caused a problem for Scrivener. We'll talk about Scrivener later, but Scrivener had a task of trying to figure out what sources the King James translators used in his 1881 Scrivener Greek New Testament. And this was during the 1881 revision of the King James Bible. We'll get there. We're not there yet. But in this, he does cite in his book, the authorized edition of the English Bible, its subsequent reprints and modern representatives. That's the title of the book. He has an appendix, and in that appendix, he lists the sources for KJV readings. On pages 262 and 263, he lists all the places where the KJV follows no Greek text at all. That's the 67. So here we have 59 places in which the KJV translators followed Stephanus against Beza. Beza was their primary source text in Greek, as the Bishop's Bible was their primary source text in English. But they used a whole bunch of others. But here's an example where 59 places the KJV translators opted for Stephanus instead of Beza, and then 67 places where they didn't follow a Greek text, and they followed something like, or they didn't follow those Greek texts, and then they followed something like the Latin Vulgate. And so on pages 262 and 263, you can see his list of all the places where the KJV translators don't use Greek. They use the Latin as their source text, just so you're aware. And then we move to 1624 because textual criticism doesn't stop. It didn't stop with the KJV translators. It was an ongoing process. In fact, it never stopped. It's still going today, and it didn't stop for any period of time after the King James translation. But this one, the House of Elsevier, was a prominent TR, or Textus Receptus, edition. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself there. It was the next critical edition, which would eventually, in its second edition, say this. And this is where we left off last week. It says in the preface in Latin, it says, "Therefore, you have now the text, now received by all, in which we give nothing altered or corrupt." And so the House of Elzevir it's two brothers. Again, I failed to write down their names. I know one of them's Abraham because it sticks out, and I forget the other one. But the two brothers are House Elzevir, and they are a publishing house, and they do the work, and they release their first edition, and then their second edition, they release this, and they put this in the preface, this line in the preface about the text now received by all. The text now received by all is where we popularize, not coin, we popularize the Textus Receptus. So when you hear Textus Receptus, the Elzevir brothers identify their text as part of a family of texts that they now say this one, ours, is the one received by all, in which we give nothing altered or corrupt. Upon first reading that, you think, wow, they're textual absolutists. They have nothing altered, nothing corrupt. Everything seems perfect in their text. And it's almost as if it's by God's divine providence that he doesn't allow anyone to release an edition, call it perfect, and then not release another edition immediately after, fixing errors. Because the Elzevir brothers released two more editions after this to fix the errors of this edition and the previous edition. And they, by the way, they say so in the preface. Like, we released another edition to fix both our mistakes and the publisher's mistakes. So because, what did I say? We might have gotten rid of scribal errors because we moved to a printing press, but we didn't get rid of printing errors. And so we have a new problem. We just replaced one problem with a new problem. And it's all the same problem. We're humans. No matter what we touch, we're bound to make mistakes. And so there we go. And this is how the class got its name, by the way, Textus Receptus, because I came out of a TR-only tradition. And so the class got its name how we received our Bibles. We received them. We didn't create them. We didn't author them. They were handed down to us from the apostles. They are handed down from us from the church fathers. They were handed down from us from the medieval church. They were handed down from us from the Reformation. And today we're looking back at our heritage of being handed down the Bible, and we're still receiving it to this day. This has always been the case. We've been receiving it all along through church history. So we're still, while we do segregate a received text from the Reformation, the received text didn't start with the Reformation. The received text was called the received text in the Latin Vulgate. That's why the reformers used it, because they were just appealing to church history. And it was also used for the Septuagint. Augustine calls the Septuagint the received text. So the received text is not a new thing. It's not something that was coined in the Reformation. It's a callback to what churches have been doing throughout church history, which was receiving the text. And the Elzevir brothers are saying, this is the text we're receiving now, which is only 500 years before that, we would have been saying the Latin Vulgate is the received text. And about 1,000 years before that, we'd be saying the Septuagint is the text we're receiving. So we're always receiving the text. The Bible in your lap today is a received text. It's not part of the Textus Receptus stream, so I'm not intending to confuse it, but I am intending to get you to understand that we're not any different. This isn't a new thing, okay? Sometimes we'll talk about streams. Sometimes it's claimed that there are two streams of text. I see this all the time. One stream comes from Alexandria, Egypt, and the other stream comes from the Byzantine Empire. One stream is corrupt, one stream is pure. And once they identify all of the different Bibles in those streams, you can identify the KJV as being part of the pure stream, and the modern translation in your lap is part of the corrupt stream. I see this type of language all the time. The problem is it's just not true. The problem is as you start to work through this, you start to see there aren't two streams. Maurice Robinson, now he's a Byzantine text advocate. reminders of what I'm talking about here, we generally have three positions today for our text. We have the Byzantine text, which is like they say we represent the majority of the manuscripts we have extant today. So we're picking majority readings, not minority readings. Then we have the Textus Receptus or King James only position, which is one I've been kind of harping on a little bit because it is the only textual absolutist position right now. And the King James translators harped on textual absolutism. We have that text. And then we have what we call reasoned eclecticism. Reasoned eclecticism is the product of reasoned eclecticism is the product of the Bibles in your laps today, unless you have a King James in your lap, or a New King James, or an MEV, or a simplified KJV. Those are all received text. I would be surprised if any of you had any majority text translations in your Bible because they're very few and far between and less popular. But so the two most popular traditions are the Textus Receptus KJV stream and the Reasoned Eclectus stream. But those two streams are not streams that go into the ancient world. One goes back to the Reformation and one goes back to the 1800s as an update to what happened in the Reformation. But Maurice Robinson, he's a Byzantine majority text. I don't like to use the word majority text because he rejects it. And I agree with him on the rejection, but it's how most people understand it. The Byzantine text stream that Maurice Robinson is an advocate of, he doesn't say there's two streams either. He says there's 5 clusters. That's what he calls them, 5 clusters. There's a cluster of Alexandrian, a cluster of Byzantine, a cluster of Caesarean, a cluster of Western, and a cluster of, I'm spacing on the 4th one, but it doesn't matter. So he says there's 5 clusters. However, most critical text scholars today don't hold either of these positions, a 2-stream position or a 5-cluster position. They're just saying it's just not that clear and simple. It's very much the idea of trying to identify whether or not there's text types or streams or clusters. As soon as they start to identify them, when they start comparing all of these texts and like, here's a text that belongs in the Byzantine. And then they keep reading and they're like, oh, that's actually a minority reading and it actually follows Alexandrian. And then they keep going. They're like, oh, that's actually a reading that follows Caesarean. Oh, wait, that reading only shows up over here. And all of a sudden they realize we can't do this. We can't have these text streams because it's impossible for us to be consistent. One manuscript might represent multiple clusters or streams or things of that nature. And so today, text critics have all but abandoned the concept of streams, clusters, or anything of that nature. And it was helpful for a time to do that. So this number is going to come up pretty frequently. We have roughly in the area of 5,800 Greek manuscripts for our New Testament. And we don't have time to evaluate every reading for all 5,800 manuscripts, roughly. It's more like 57 something, okay? So we don't have time to evaluate all of them. So what they did is they would take key test passages and they would evaluate the key test passages. And based on how those key test passages were read, they would dump them in a cluster or they would dump them in a stream. Early text criticism in the 1800s had streams. Now we have clusters, or then we had clusters. Now we're just like, now that we're able to evaluate them more closely, more thoroughly, we're like, we can't do this. This doesn't work. It was helpful for a time when we didn't have technology. Now, what changed? What changed was computers. Computers, now we can digitize them and we can compare them quickly. And we can just really look and we can let a computer read it and tell us the differences. And all of a sudden we're like, oh, this is far more complicated than we've been doing it. And so now they're like text streams, text clusters. This is not a thing. And so now we're in a different situation. Now we're working on how do we work through all of these textual variants. So we'll keep going. So again, scholars have eliminated this sort of nomenclature. This is, by the way, relatively new, probably within the past 15 years, that we're not doing streams anymore. We're not doing clusters. It doesn't work. It's not consistent. And so what's interesting here is text criticism doesn't stop, right? We're at the House of Elsevier, where nothing is altered or corrupt, if you want to believe that statement. If you want to believe that statement from the second edition or the third edition or the fourth edition, and you also want to believe that the King James translation is nothing altered, nothing corrupt, you're going to have a problem because the Elsevier text and the King James translation do not overlap perfectly. There are plenty of places where the Elsevier has a reading that does not follow the King James reading. And so you're going to have to, at some point, make a choice whether or not you're going to follow Elsevier or the King James or some other critical text edition. And that became the crux for me when I was in KJVism. I was brought up as actually TR only. That was the tradition we were in, Textus Receptus only. And the idea was that the King James translation was a faithful translation of the Textus Receptus. And I think that's still relatively true. But when I was able to identify places that the King James didn't follow the Textus Receptus at all, or the Masoretic text, instead of concluding that the KJV could be updated to match those places, the leadership in my church would jump through her hoops to demonstrate that the King James was correct. And that was when I realized in my previous church that King James, TR onlyism, the more I began to test it, the more I began to realize it didn't exist. It was really King James onlyism. And TR onlyism was just extra steps to get you to King James onlyism. And so part of my research was actually Scrivener, because Scrivener, they brought into their camp. They said Scrivener was a KJV guy. He was not, by the way. Scrivener was a KJV guy. Look at the text he produced, which underlies the King James Version. And Scrivener's appendix, his Latin Vulgate appendix, 262 to 263, I started working through that, and I realized this isn't Greek. This is Latin. And we were told the Latin is part of the corrupt stream. That's what I grew up on. The Latin Vulgate is part of the corrupt stream. And so as I began to press these issues, it became clear to me that no matter what any other manuscript, no matter what any other text said, the King James was right, period. And I realized, oh, we're not TR only, we're King James only. And so part of the problem, though, we have to do is define what the Textus Receptus is. So when we started this section on early church to Reformation era translations, which is the section we're closing out right now, remember I talked about the Septuagint, and I talked about the Latin Vulgate, and I talked about the Syriac Peshitta, and I told you I'm going to use the definite article, but bear in mind there is no monolithic singular the Septuagint. No monolithic singular, the Latin Vulgate. No monolithic singular, the Syriac Peshitta. Just like there's no monolithic singular, the KJV. No monolithic singular, the ESV, the CSB. Because they all have editions. And multiple editions create multiple readings. And eventually we say, this is a family. It's a family of Greek manuscripts of the Old Testament that we call the Septuagint. It's a family of Hebrew manuscripts that we call the Masoretic text. It's a family of Arabic Old and New Testaments that we call the Syriac Peshitta. It's a family of Latin translations that we call the Latin Vulgate. Okay? It's a family. Problem is, that's not how people always use that when they talk about the Textus Receptus, because of the textual absolutist position. If you're not a textual absolutist, and I'm not, and I say the Textus Receptus, I'll tell you what I mean in a minute when we're going to get to it, but I generally mean the family of manuscripts, not manuscripts, the family of printed editions of the Reformation era Bibles. That's generally what I mean. But different people mean different things when they say Textus Receptus. So you do need to get them to define it if you're going to engage in some of this conversation. So one group of people might say the Elsevier editions. They were the ones that got the name, the Elsevier editions. And then from there, you're going to have to get them to define, if they're textual absolutists, you got to get them to define which edition. First, second, third, or fourth. Which edition of the Elsevier editions is the pure text, uncorrupted, unaltered? And then compare that to the KJV and watch them abandon the Elsevier for the KJV. Next is Stephanus 1550. The Stephanus 1550 gets wide reception, much more than Beza, much more than Elzevir. The churches that become a diplomatic translation of Stephanus outside of English, Spanish, French, German, et cetera, blows up. Stephanus really does become a received text. And so there are some today that says Stephanus is the received text, particularly the 1550 edition. This position was actually one I held. When I'll explain why I rejected Scrivener in a little bit, because my church was a Scrivener position, I ended up rejecting that position in favor of Stephanus. Blue Letter Bible on your phone or your app or your web browser. I use Blue Letter Bible all the time. Their Textus Receptus is the Stephanus 1550. So where there are places where the King James doesn't agree with Stephanus, and you go to the interlinear text and you click on the interlinear button for that word, you might get Stephanus's reading and not Beza's, which is what they chose. Just as an FYI, I've run across it multiple times. Stephanus is their Textus Receptus. There's another man by the name of Doug Wilson. Doug Wilson, who's an advocate for the Textus Receptus position, when pressed by James White, he said, if you're going to pin me to the wall on a revision, I pick the Stephanus 1550. So this position is one of the larger positions out there. Then the third position is the family of TRs from Erasmus through the critical editions until 1831. And so this is the position I hold as well. When I talk about the Textus Receptus, this is what I mean. I mean the family of Textus Receptus printed Greek editions from Erasmus chronologically, because Complutensian Polyglot I also put in there, but they finished before Erasmus, but they published after Erasmus. So anyway, all the printed editions chronologically in order published from Erasmus to 1831. The reason why we tend to stop at 1831 is because 1831, there was a shift in textual criticism, and that shift was great enough to depart from what we would call the family of texts of Textus Receptus. And then probably the next and the most popular Greek edition that people are going to talk about is the Scrivener 1881. We're going to talk more about him later, but I'm going to just most people, when they say the TR, this is what they're referring to. They are referring to Scrivener's 1881 edition. Scrivener 1881, we're still working our way towards that date, so I'm kind of introducing stuff prematurely for you guys, but it's helpful to talk about this when we talk about the Textus Receptus. Scrivener was part of a team of text critics and translators who were officially commissioned to update the King James Bible by Cambridge and the Church of England. We're going to get there. Scrivener's part of that team. He had a particular job on that team, and that part of that job was to produce a Greek text that matched the King James Version. Now, why did he have to produce such a work? Because the King James Version was an eclectic text that chose readings from different English and Greek and Latin Bibles. And there was no manuscript that exists, no printed edition that existed that matched the King James translation in all places. And the reason why Scrivener needs to do this is because they're going to update both the Greek Bible and the English Bible. And in order to be accountable, they want to show everybody every change that they're making. But they can't update the Greek Bible because it doesn't exist. The Greek Bible that underlies the KJV. It doesn't exist. There is no such Bible. That it wasn't a diplomatic translation. It was an eclectic translation. And so Scrivener needs to now produce a Bible that matches the King James so that it's easier for people to see the changes that they made. And so Scrivener spends a long time, roughly 10 years working on this project, matching all of the King James words to a Greek text, except in places where he says, I couldn't find a Greek text to support the King James reading here. However, I do find the Latin Vulgate to support the King James reading here. And so what Scrivener does in those situations is he looks through the Greek manuscripts and he tries to find the closest word semantically to the Latin that would come the closest to what the King James translators did. And so they're not, some people accuse Scrivener as back translating, and I think that's a bad way to do it. Back translating is suggesting that they're translating from English into Greek. What Scrivener's actually doing, a better term, is reverse engineering. He's reverse engineering. He's trying to figure out the process the King James translators use to do that. Now, the argument for most King James translators today is what we call a jot and tittle argument. It comes from Matthew. I'm going to quote the verse in a minute. But the jot and tittle argument is essentially the argument that every letter of the Greek, of the Textus Receptus, is jot and tittle perfect. Every letter, every stroke of every letter in its place in the right order. That's jot and tittle perfection. And that's what they believe this Textus Receptus represents. And when they say Scrivener is that text, then they're putting Scrivener there. I had a project that I gave myself in which I wanted to go through and find all of the different places where the King James translators departed from Scrivener. And went with, or not Scrivener, from Beza, and see what text they chose instead. I wanted to do that work myself. I didn't have access at the time. I didn't have access to Scrivener, but I was doing work beyond what Scrivener was doing. And now my Greek is mediocre at best. In fact, that might be giving it too much praise. My Greek is horrible. I wouldn't rely on me for Greek. Let's just put it that way. However, you don't have to be really good at Greek in order to do the work I'm doing, because what I was doing was comparing every single letter. And that's easy. I knew all the letters of the Greek alphabet, and I could just go letter by letter. And when I saw a difference, mark the difference and figure out what that difference made. And sometimes it was a whole word. Sometimes it was just a letter. And as I was working through Scrivener, I kept coming across a missing letter. A missing letter, a missing letter, a missing letter at the end of many words. And I couldn't figure out what it was that I was looking at. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about, because Scrivener made a stylistic decision, and that stylistic decision that he decided to do is what caused him to drop all these letters. So I'll give you an example in English. Up there, we have an indefinite article and a noun. And the indefinite article is a or an, and the noun, it doesn't matter, but it's dog and elephant, it doesn't matter. But you will notice right away that a and an are indefinite articles. Are they, let me ask you this, are they identical words? No. They are identical words, but they are not they're not identical in spelling. However, if I said, this is how we're going to say it, and dog and a elephant, even if they were identical words, you would say that's not right. That's wrong. That's incorrect. And so despite the fact that they are, in fact, identical words, they do not mean anything different, because a word is defined by what it means, not by what it means and how it's used, not by how you spell it. Okay? So, and dog and a elephant, you'd say that is incorrect. That is not how we use those words. Though identical, we don't use them that way. And so when we use and you know the rule, you probably know the rule, we use an indefinite article a when the word that follows it has a consonant sound. And we use an indefinite article an when the word that follows it has a vowel sound. Okay? That's how we use the words. Now, you know, in this class, language can change. Language can change. So it is totally possible, though I don't see any indication that it's going that way currently, but it is totally possible for us to drop the use of the word an altogether and just stick with a, and everything will be a dog, a elephant, a ocean, etc., etc., etc. Okay, that could happen, and in fact, it has happened with some words. In fact, there's always question over words that begin with the letter H. He is an honest governor, or he is a honest governor. And people will say, well, it depends on if you pronounce the H or not. Like, is it a horse or an horse? And so that's why they're like, oh, it's more about the vowel sound than about the than about the letter. So honest, O, no H, so an. Horse, so A. But there are other words that some people pronounce the H and some people don't. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but that's what will cause some of this to start occurring and language changes. Now, in the jot and tittle position, they get this verse. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, not one jot or tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled. This verse is the underlying verse for most KJV only positions. It's the idea that because a jot and tittle are English words for Hebrew letters. Okay, jot and tittle are English words for Hebrew letters. Actually, the tittle is not a letter at all. It's a stroke. Okay, it's a stroke of a letter. And the jot is or the yod is the smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet. It's the equivalent to an apostrophe in English for size. Okay, so not the smallest letter or the smallest stroke will pass away from the law until all be fulfilled. Now, if you believe this is about the preservation of every letter of the Old Testament, then you're going to be forced into a position, as I'm going to demonstrate, where you're going to have to reject pretty much the entire transmission of the Bible. Or you can just understand that you've misunderstood this verse, and this verse is about the authority of the Old Testament. And this is about, and Jesus is using a rhetoric called metonymy. Metonymy is when you refer to something small to refer to the greatest part. For example, if I say to you, lend me your ear, lend me your ear. One, I don't mean for you to literally take off your ear and give it to me. This would be an incorrect interpretation of what I'm saying. Secondly, I also don't mean for you to actually listen to me while ignoring me with your eyes. Okay? When I say lend me your ear, I mean I want your whole body focused on me. I want your undivided attention. And so ear is the metonymy for all of you. I want your entire focus on me. Okay? So when Jesus says that not one jot or tittle is going to pass away from the law, he's using metonymy. He's saying the authority of the law, which, by the way, is the context. The context in this passage, if you read the whole passage, is the Pharisees accusing Jesus of getting rid of the authority of the law and replacing it with his own authority. And he says, no, I'm not doing away with the law. In fact, the law is not going to be done away with until all be fulfilled. The law still stands. I'm not changing the authority of the law. Not the smallest piece of authority that the law has over you is changing. Okay? That's what Jesus is referring to. It's a metonymy. But nonetheless, bad interpretation leads bad doctrine. So the textual absolutist is saying that this is about preservation of the very letters of the Old Testament and consequently also of the New Testament, because God doesn't change, and therefore what he did for the old, he does for the new. So it just carries over. Now, with that in mind, and, jot and tittle perfection, every letter in its place at all times. What Scrivener does is, in Greek, there's something called the movable nu. Movable nu. Nu is just the word for the letter N in Greek. Okay, so a movable N, if that makes it easier for you to understand. Movable nu. And I'm going to do it in English because the Greek it's not going to mean anything to you, but I'll do it for you in English so you see. So in a case where we have something like this is what the movable nu does. We say a and an before vowel sounds of nouns. That's the only time. It's an indefinite article for nouns. Greek does something similar, but it has nothing to do with the grammar structure of the words. It has to do with if two words, one word ends in a vowel sound and the next word begins with a vowel sound. It doesn't matter if they're nouns, articles, or anything. If the first word ends in a vowel sound and the next word begins in a vowel sound, they will drop in an N at the end of the second sound to break up the sounds. So blue ocean, this is a very blue ocean. Those vowel sounds, they run into each other. And Greek grammar says we don't want those vowel sounds to run into each other. And so we put in N in between the words. So it's balloon ocean. So you can hear the division between the words. As things happen, language change happens, the Greek language eventually drops this practice. And when Scrivener is doing his Greek New Testament, he does it with some modern Greek rules. And so he drops the movable new everywhere in the New Testament. And I kept running across it as I was comparing letters. I'm looking at Reformation era Textus, Receptus, and Scrivener, and I'm looking at it and I'm like, why is this letter constantly missing as I'm working through every time? And I didn't know what I was looking at. I had to learn this, that there was this movable new. And so I brought that up. I said, how do we talk about jot and tittle perfection in my leadership? And Scrivener has dropped the letter N throughout the entire New Testament. Is that jot and tittle perfection? I'm going to leave you hanging on that one because we're going to come back and I'll answer how they answered that later, because it's going to come up again later and it will make more sense when I bring it up in that context. So I'll leave you hanging on that. How do they answer this objection? Because this became my objection. Then the last Textus Receptus position is that the KJV itself is the Textus Receptus. And they abandon all the Greek. And they just say whatever the KJV translation says is the case. Now, unfortunately, I think of all the positions up here, this is the worst position, where to say the Greek doesn't matter, whatever the KJV says is what God preserved. God preserved his inspired words in the KJV. I do believe translation plays a part in preservation, but it is not the act of preservation itself. Okay? And so what I found, though, is that no matter which position you take up there, eventually, when you deal with people who are Textus Receptus only, they all eventually end up in the last category of King James Version only, because the King James translation does not follow any Textus Receptus or family of Textus Receptus decisions 100%. And instead of saying, yes, we can update the KJV here, which is what I wanted to do, we're TR only. That's our position. We're TR only. Why don't we update the KJV to match the TR in places where it didn't? They gave us permission to do so in their preface. This is where the rubber met the road for me there. And eventually, I was asked to stop talking about this or leave because I realized we're not TR only. We're actually KJV only. And that went against our position in our statement of faith, which they updated, which we're going to talk about later. So the problem is textual criticism didn't end. Neither did translation of the English Bible, didn't end in 1611. It kept going. And we're going to talk about this next week. But basically, next week, there are 4 parts to your scripture. There's your source text, there's the apparatus, there's your translation, and there's your footnotes. Next week, we're going to talk about how those progressed through the 17 and 1800s, just as an overview, and then where do we go from there when we get to the late 1800s? And we're going to talk about the next section, how we receive the very words of our Bible. You all are dismissed. Thank you for your attention.